What if everything you thought you knew about World War II was only the surface? Behind the battles and victories lie secrets so dark, so twisted, that history itself tried to bury them forever. Hidden alliances, erased events, and forbidden weapons that could have changed the fate of millions. What if these disturbing truths were finally uncovered? Tonight, we open a box that was never meant to be opened. Brace yourself. Some horrors refuse to stay buried. The explosion shook the Wolf's Lair at exactly 12:42 p.m. on July 20, 1944. Smoke filled the conference room, and screams echoed in the concrete corridors. By the time the dust settled, Adolf Hitler was dead, his body shattered beneath the weight of a polished oak conference table. News reached Berlin within the hour. Operation Valkyrie, the resistance plan embedded within the German military's own contingency strategies, launched with terrifying efficiency. Within 3 hours, Stauffenberg stood at the center of the Bendler block, delivering orders under the name of the new National Emergency Government. SS leaders were arrested. Communications hubs were seized. Civilian radio stations broadcast pre-written speeches declaring the restoration of German law and the end of National Socialism. Resistance forces moved fast. By midnight, Joseph Goebbels had been executed in his office, Himmler poisoned himself in a bunker near Poznan, and Göring was captured attempting to flee in civilian clothes. But the euphoria didn't last long. Germany was a country held together by fear and bureaucracy. As news of Hitler's death spread, cracks formed everywhere. Army Group Center declared neutrality. Loyal SS commanders in Austria and Norway refused to recognize the new government. Albert Speer, the architect of Hitler's economic war machine, pledged allegiance to the Valkyrie Republic, but he was one of the few. In occupied France, the Wehrmacht hesitated. Field Marshal Rommel, recovering from an assassination attempt blamed on Allied bombers, awoke to chaos. His allegiance could swing the war. But the Allies didn't wait for decisions. The British hesitated to believe it. Churchill, weary and skeptical, feared a trap. Roosevelt was intrigued but cautious. Stalin, however, was furious. The fascist snake, he declared in a secret Kremlin meeting, has shed its skin. It is still a snake. The Red Army, already deep into Poland, refused to halt. In Berlin, the Valkyrie Republic hastily rebranded itself as the German Provisional Authority. It called for an armistice. It promised the dissolution of the Nazi Party, the closure of all concentration camps, and full cooperation with Allied tribunals. But peace required trust, and trust was in short supply. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender. The new German command refused. As autumn bled into winter, the war entered its bloodiest phase. The Eastern Front exploded. Stalin, now racing against time, pushed his forces with brutal speed. German cities fell one by one, Königsberg, then Danzig, then Breslau. The Provisional Authority moved its capital to Frankfurt as Berlin became a battlefield. Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies advanced cautiously through the Low Countries, unsure whether to treat the new German regime as friend or foe. Inside Germany, civil war festered. SS loyalists formed the Iron Resistance, conducting bombings and assassinations in urban centers. A mysterious general known only as Wotan broadcast anti-republic propaganda from a secret base in the Alps. Old party members vanished underground, forming a clandestine shadow government. Civilians were caught in the middle. In November 1944, the German Provisional Authority signed a secret agreement with Allied intelligence, cede the western half of Germany in exchange for a promise not to allow Soviet occupation. Eisenhower called it a dangerous but necessary bargain. Stalin called it betrayal. His forces surged past the Oder River. In a desperate act, the Provisional Authority sabotaged all bridges leading into Frankfurt, declaring the city a free zone. That winter, Germany fractured entirely. The East fell under Soviet occupation. The West became a patchwork of Allied zones. The Valkyrie Republic survived, but only barely. Its army was broken, its leadership scattered, and its future uncertain. Claus von Stauffenberg never saw it. He was executed by rogue SS troops 3 weeks after the coup. His body was displayed in a public square in Munich, a warning that even among enemies, there were deeper enemies still. But the ideals of the Valkyrie Republic lived on. In 1946, the surviving members of the Provisional Authority formed the Frankfurt Convention, a democratic assembly tasked with writing a new constitution. They included former officers, political prisoners, and even a handful of Jewish intellectuals who had returned from exile. The new Germany was built on shaky ground, but it was built. Elsewhere, things were not so clean. The Soviet-occupied East declared itself the German Socialist People's Republic in 1947, echoing Stalin's every word. A new Berlin Wall began to rise, but this time, it surrounded a Soviet-controlled Berlin inside a free West Germany. The Cold War had begun, but its front lines were inside German borders. Rommel, cleared of suspicion, became the first Chancellor of the Republic. He spent the rest of his life denying that he ever supported the Nazis. His speeches, broadcast across Europe, were filled with pleas for forgiveness, unity, and the promise that Germany will never again raise a sword in hatred. The world changed. Europe was rebuilt not from victory, but from compromise. Trials were held in Frankfurt, not Nuremberg. The documents of the Provisional Authority, the Valkyrie Files, became mandatory reading in every German school by the 1960s. In time, the Valkyrie Republic became a symbol, not just of rebellion, but of a moment when history cracked open and the future rushed in. And yet, historians still ask, did the bomb save Europe from itself, or simply delay the reckoning? At 3:17 a.m. on March 3, 1942, a fisherman off the coast of Long Island radioed in a strange sight: dark silhouettes, larger than whales, moving silently beneath the waves. Moments later, radar stations near Montauk lit up with signals. The first Nazi invasion fleet, consisting of 6 experimental submarines and 2 submersible landing carriers, had arrived in American waters undetected. Operation Dämmerung, Twilight, was not just a military gamble. It was a psychological strike, forged in Hitler's growing desperation. With Britain bloodied but unbroken and the Eastern Front dragging into disaster, the Führer turned westward. His idea was insane, and yet it almost worked. Bring the war to American shores and shatter the U.S. morale before it could fully awaken. Within hours, saboteurs embedded in New York City activated. Bridges were destroyed. Telephone exchanges exploded. Radio towers went dark. Then the unimaginable happened. German paratroopers, launched from stealth zeppelins under experimental radar cloaking material, descended over Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. Manhattan awoke to the sound of gunfire. The initial goal was not total occupation. It was disruption, shock, and seizure of key infrastructure. They wanted the ports, the airfields, the government panic. And they got it. President Roosevelt, stunned by the scale of the attack, was rushed from Washington to a secure facility in Ohio. Congress declared a state of continental emergency for the first time in history. Martial law spread across the eastern seaboard. And still, the Nazi wave pushed west. Within 2 weeks, the Germans controlled half of Long Island and had dug into Staten Island. They didn't hold ground easily. Resistance from civilians, police, and a hastily deployed National Guard was fierce, but the psychological damage was done. American newspapers called it the day the war came home. The U.S. military, still rearming and stretched thin in the Pacific, scrambled to respond. General George Patton, pulled from training duty in California, was placed in charge of Fortress America, the defensive military command tasked with pushing the enemy out. But it wasn't just New York. A second wave of German infiltration hit the New Jersey coast, using captured French fishing boats modified for stealth. Philadelphia braced for attack. Washington, D.C. became a ghost city, its government evacuated to emergency facilities beneath Chicago. The capital's monuments were sandbagged. Anti-aircraft guns dotted the National Mall. And amid the chaos, a myth was born. The Exodus. As the eastern cities boiled with conflict, millions fled westward. The highways clogged. Families traveled in freight trains, in pickup trucks, in caravans of bicycles and stolen fuel tankers. Manhattan itself, surrounded by water and fire, became a desperate island of refugees. Naval commanders issued the total evacuation protocol and began transporting civilians across the Hudson by night. They called it the Manhattan Exodus, the largest emergency migration in U.S. history. Over 2 million people left the island in 3 weeks, fleeing a war that had never been meant to reach them. The Nazis didn't conquer New York in the traditional sense, but they occupied its ghosts. For months, gunfire rang through Harlem. Skirmishes erupted in Central Park. The Empire State Building was hit by a rogue shell and partially collapsed. German sniper nests took root in luxury apartments once belonging to stockbrokers and jazz legends. By May, the American counteroffensive began. Patton launched Operation Iron Fist, a brutal campaign to retake the Northeast. Battles raged in the suburbs of Connecticut and New Jersey. In Yonkers, a German artillery battalion was destroyed by a force of New York firefighters turned insurgents. Guerrilla warfare consumed the outer boroughs. Civilians trapped behind German lines became spies, saboteurs, and assassins. Underground movements formed, the Liberty Cells, comprised of schoolteachers, bartenders, ex-cons, and immigrants. Their most famous figure, a Puerto Rican nurse named Elena Velez, became known as the Angel of Midtown, leading medical and resistance efforts in the ruins of Grand Central Station. By the summer of 1942, the tide turned. American air superiority was finally restored. The U.S. Navy, learning from its earlier failures, hunted down the remaining Nazi subs. German reinforcements, expected from occupied France, never arrived, cut off by the Royal Navy and internal sabotage. Hitler, furious and humiliated, redirected his focus back to Russia. But the damage was done. The war had come to America, and America was no longer the same. When U.S. troops finally reclaimed the smoldering remains of Manhattan in September, they found a city hollowed but defiant. Street art filled the walls with slogans like, "Still here." Churches rang bells in defiance. Survivors emerged from subways and bomb shelters waving American flags made from torn bedsheets. And then came the reckoning. Congress, reassembled in Chicago, passed the Continental Defense Act, which permanently militarized all coastal defenses. Cities began building bunkers beneath schools. The FBI expanded powers exponentially. Civil liberties contracted in the name of survival. But not all of America agreed. A growing number of voices, academics, war veterans, and religious leaders, warned that the Nazi invasion had not just broken the coastline, but the soul of the nation. They saw the emergence of something new, a fearful, more authoritarian America. "The war shook our shores," said one commentator in 1943, "but it also shook loose our Constitution." Years later, when the full scope of Operation Damarung was declassified, historians were stunned to discover how close it came to total success. A final phase, known only as Phase Nachtwolf, had been scheduled for 1943, if the first wave held. It involved the deployment of chemical weapons over Washington and the potential use of dirty bombs in Chicago. But that phase never came. The Nazis were driven out. America emerged victorious, but deeply scarred. New York rebuilt. The skyline changed, but the spirit endured. Memorials dotted every borough. And every March 3rd, the city went silent at 3:17 a.m. to remember the night the ocean swallowed the world, and it spat back steel. At dawn on December 7, 1941, Admiral Nagumo's carrier fleet launched a coordinated airstrike on Pearl Harbor. That part of history is unchanged. But in this timeline, what followed wasn't a retreat, it was an invasion. While American forces struggled to recover from the devastation, a second Japanese task force emerged from the shadows. Under the command of Admiral Yamashita, it carried an elite amphibious assault division, trained in secrecy for months. Their objective: seize Oahu and the Hawaiian Islands before the United States could retaliate. By 1 p.m., Japanese paratroopers descended over Schofield Barracks and Wheeler Field. Simultaneously, landing craft surged ashore on the beaches of Waikiki, Ava, and Kaneohe. Resistance was fierce, but disorganized. With most U.S. Pacific assets either destroyed or still burning in the harbor, Hawaii stood nearly defenseless. By December 10, the rising sun flew above Iolani Palace. Washington was in shock. The American people, reeling from the initial Pearl Harbor bombing, now learned that Hawaii had fallen. Roosevelt addressed the nation in the most somber broadcast of his presidency. "We have lost a star from our flag," he said. "But we have not lost our resolve." But resolve wasn't enough. The Japanese consolidated power rapidly. They declared Hawaii a protectorate of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Civilians were interned or coerced into labor. Native Hawaiians, treated with cautious suspicion, were forced into separate settlements under the watch of the Kempitai, Japanese military police. The occupation was brutal, but not absolute. From the beginning, a resistance movement emerged. Former U.S. soldiers, native islanders, and even disillusioned Japanese Americans who had escaped the mainland internment orders banded together. They called themselves Na Lele Manu, the Ghost Birds. Operating out of the volcanic forests of the Big Island and the hidden lava tubes of Maui, the Ghost Birds waged a campaign of sabotage, espionage, and assassination. They tapped into Japanese communication lines, ambushed supply convoys, and guided Allied submarines to hidden landing sites. The Japanese responded with terror. Entire villages were razed. Suspected sympathizers were tortured and executed. Beaches were mined. Schools were converted into command bunkers. The old Hawaiian flag was banned. Japanese currency replaced the dollar. The Hawaiian language was outlawed. Despite it all, the resistance grew. In the shadows, America planned a return. By mid-1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz, operating from a secret naval base near Anchorage, began assembling what would become known as the Ghost Fleet. It wasn't official yet. The term referred to a patchwork force of salvaged ships, experimental stealth craft, modified merchant vessels, and Black Ops submarines. Their crews were handpicked, exiled sailors, native Hawaiian scouts, demolition experts, and Marines trained in jungle warfare. Their mission: bleed the occupiers dry until the U.S. could launch a full-scale counterattack. Throughout 1943, the Ghost Fleet conducted a relentless campaign of hit-and-run warfare. They sank Japanese supply ships, sabotaged harbors, and smuggled arms to the Ghost Birds. One vessel, the USS Wailoa, became legendary after it disguised itself as a Japanese cargo ship, entered Pearl Harbor under cover of fog, and detonated explosives that destroyed 3 enemy destroyers and a fuel depot. Tokyo was furious. The occupation, once hailed as a flawless victory, had become a quagmire. On the mainland, the American war machine mobilized like never before. Remember Hawaii replaced Remember the Maine in public consciousness. War bonds surged. Propaganda posters depicted hula dancers in chains, tiki torches turned to spears. Recruitment in the Pacific Northwest tripled. But time was running out. By late 1943, Japan began constructing a massive airfield complex on the Big Island. Its purpose: launch bomber raids on the West Coast. With the right fuel loads, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and even Seattle could come under attack. The U.S. had to act. Operation Hoola, Restoration, was launched on January 2, 1944. It began with a coordinated naval assault from 3 directions: west from Midway, north from Alaska, and south from American Samoa. The Ghost Fleet led the charge, clearing landing zones with surgical strikes. Behind them came the largest amphibious invasion in Pacific history. The battle for Oahu lasted 47 days. Waikiki became a war zone. Japanese troops had fortified every beach, every hotel, every garden. Snipers took positions in church steeples. Barbed wire crossed the streets of Honolulu. Bunkers were hidden beneath the old sugar plantations. Mines littered the rainforests. The Ghost Birds, now nearly 3,000 strong, coordinated with American forces in a brilliant network of guerrilla warfare. They guided paratroopers through the lava tunnels of Mauna Loa. They led nighttime ambushes with handmade torches. They brought vengeance to the invaders with every bullet. On February 19, 1944, the Japanese command center in Pearl Harbor was taken. U.S. Marines raised the American flag over the shattered naval base as explosions rocked the shoreline. Hawaii was free. The cost was staggering. Over 60,000 casualties on both sides. Entire towns had been destroyed. Sacred lands were scarred. But the islands endured. In the years that followed, the occupation became a subject of national reckoning. The Hawaiian people were finally granted full statehood in 1949, 5 years earlier than in the original timeline. The ghost birds were honored in a memorial at Pu'uhonua o Honaunau. Their stories became legend. But scars remained. Cultural identity, long suppressed, took decades to recover. The occupation had left behind ghosts, not just in the form of bodies, but in the trauma of language lost, families divided, and traditions erased. Historians still debate whether the Japanese conquest was a tactical victory or strategic folly. One thing is certain: had Hawaii remained under enemy control, the war in the Pacific, and the shape of the modern world, would have been unrecognizably different. In the end, it was neither the size of fleets nor the firepower of armies that reclaimed Hawaii. It was the will of a people who refused to surrender their home, and the shadows that moved beneath the waves to bring them hope. In a quiet villa in Zurich in 1933, Albert Einstein signed a letter of renunciation, his formal departure from German citizenship. But in this timeline, the pen faltered. A different letter, a different decision. Spooked by rising tensions in the US and haunted by visions of global communism, Einstein did not emigrate to America. Instead, he accepted an invitation from a former colleague, Dr. Werner Heisenberg. The deal was Faustian. Einstein would serve as an advisor to the German Uran project, the Nazi nuclear program, on one condition: no military use. Heisenberg, playing a dangerous game of diplomacy and survival, agreed. What followed was the most secretive scientific operation of the war. In this version of history, Hitler never knew the full scope of what he possessed. The nuclear project was disguised under the name Project Morgenrot, Dawnlight. Its facilities were buried deep beneath the Bavarian Alps, powered by slave labor and guarded by the SS' most ruthless division, the Black Circle. By 1943, Morgenrot had succeeded where others failed. Using a design Einstein had once theorized and then abandoned in shame, the team created a prototype uranium gun-type weapon, codenamed Donner, after the Germanic god of thunder. The war, meanwhile, had turned. Stalingrad was a graveyard. The Allies prepared for an invasion of Europe. But Hitler, ever prideful, demanded vengeance first. A single strike to crush morale and force surrender. London. On May 22, 1944, a strange aircraft breached British airspace. It flew high, too high for Spitfires, and left a trail that glowed green in the night. At 2:41 a.m., a blinding light consumed the heart of the city. A mushroom cloud bloomed above Parliament. Over 90,000 perished in a single instant. The Thames boiled. Big Ben melted into a steel skeleton. The world changed forever. Churchill, miraculously unharmed, addressed a stunned planet: "London has burned. But the spirit of Britain burns brighter still. We shall not surrender." But Britain was not the only audience. Stalin's eyes narrowed. Roosevelt paled. Einstein, hearing the news from a secret radio in a Bavarian laboratory, collapsed in horror. Hitler was triumphant. For the first time, he felt he possessed a true wonder weapon. He demanded more. But Morgenrot was not ready. The team had only 2 devices left, both incomplete. Einstein, in an act of desperation, sabotaged the project by destroying key magnetic components before fleeing into the mountains. He was captured within a week. The second bomb, completed under pressure, was rushed to the Eastern Front. On July 4, 1944, the city of Minsk became ash. Stalin vowed retaliation. The Soviet Union, now fully convinced of German nuclear capability, halted its westward offensive and fell back to defensive lines near Smolensk. Fearing Berlin would now dominate the continent, Roosevelt authorized the Manhattan Project to accelerate at all costs. Scientists were pulled from across the globe, including refugee physicists once considered security risks. In September 1944, Los Alamos succeeded. The Trinity test was no longer a test, it was a declaration. By November, both sides had the bomb. The Cold War began before the Hot War ended. Instead of D-Day, there was the Treaty of Reykjavik, an uneasy truce, brokered in Iceland, where the Allies recognized a nuclear-armed Nazi Germany in exchange for an end to hostilities. France remained occupied. The Low Countries became neutralized buffer states. Eastern Europe was divided into Soviet and Nazi spheres of influence. And Einstein, he was never seen again. Some believe he was executed by the SS in a private ceremony, his ashes scattered in a river near Salzburg. Others claimed he escaped, lived under an alias in Argentina, and spent his final years writing mathematical proofs no one ever saw. A few whispered he had returned to the US in secret and helped design the hydrogen bomb. By the 1950s, the world had split into three camps: the Teutonic Bloc, led by Berlin, the Comintern, dominated by Moscow, and the Atlantic Pact, led by a United States that no longer trusted anyone. Europe was frozen. Spy wars replaced open battle. Assassinations became diplomacy. Berlin's skyline glowed with symbols of power: zeppelins patrolling the skies, uranium-powered trains, mechanical soldiers parading through the streets. In this timeline, the Holocaust had occurred more quietly, its scale revealed only decades later by defectors and whistleblowers. The Germans kept their crimes buried under a mantle of nuclear deterrence and propaganda. Those who questioned disappeared. School children across Germany were taught that Einstein had gifted the Reich the ultimate power. His face, ironically, was stamped onto coins. The irony was not lost on the few who remembered. In America, fear became policy. Civil defense drills became mandatory. Fallout shelters were standard in suburban homes. The FBI transformed into an internal intelligence agency, rivaling the Gestapo in paranoia. Dissent was treason. The US had not lost the war, but it had lost its innocence. And Einstein's ghost haunted both sides. In hidden files at Los Alamos, his equations were still studied, labeled E-shadows. In Berlin, his sabotage notes were locked away in the black archives. Both sides feared what he might have created if given time. Whispers of Donner 2, a weapon capable of altering weather, surfaced in spy communiques. Some claimed Einstein had been working on something greater than a bomb, something that could unmake the very fabric of reality. But these were just stories, or warnings. The nuclear age had begun not with a race, but with a betrayal. And though the world stood in equilibrium, it was an equilibrium balanced on a wire of uranium and guilt. All because one man, faced with the chaos of his era, chose the wrong path for what he believed was the right reason. The morning of June 22, 1941, began like any other in Moscow. Clouds gathering over Red Square, trains whistling through distant stations, the smell of coal and cabbage heavy in the air. But there was no Operation Barbarossa. No German invasion. No betrayal. In this timeline, Hitler did not turn east. Instead, Stalin accepted his offer. It began as a whisper, a secret clause buried deep in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in blood and vodka. The clause promised a shared world, split in two. Germany ruling the West, the Soviets the East. Hitler would get Europe. Stalin, Asia. Together, they would destroy the bourgeois empires that had humiliated both. In August 1941, while the British watched the skies for bombs, a shocking announcement hit global radio. Joseph Stalin, General Secretary of the Soviet Union, declared that the historical destinies of the worker and the soldier now march in unity. Nazi and Soviet troops paraded together in Warsaw under red and black flags, their boots clicking in perfect rhythm. The world reeled. Churchill called it the nightmare alignment. Roosevelt fumed behind closed doors. The global balance cracked. France was already under Nazi control. Now, the East was closed off completely. The Soviet war machine pivoted, no longer braced for invasion but poised to expand. Japan, emboldened by the news, signed a secondary pact binding the Axis into a three-headed dragon of steel. With the Soviets on their side, the Nazis found new life. Oil flowed from the Caucasus. Tanks built in Stalingrad rolled into Yugoslavia. Communist partisans in Greece, once heroes of resistance, now hunted Allied agents in the hills. Berlin and Moscow coordinated strategies by telegram. Heisenberg and Soviet physicists exchanged notes on uranium refinement. The Iron Curtain fell, only this time it wrapped around the entire continent. In early 1942, Operation Anvil began. It wasn't an invasion. It was a hammer blow. Combined Axis forces, with Soviet divisions in the lead, stormed through Turkey, Iran, and into British India. The Raj collapsed. In Calcutta, portraits of Lenin and Hitler hung side by side. Australian forces, isolated and desperate, fell back toward the coasts. And then came Africa. Rommel, reinforced with Soviet artillery and Siberian infantry, swept across the continent. Cairo fell. The Suez Canal flew the flags of both tyrannies. In a twisted pageant, Hitler and Stalin met in person atop the ruins of the British Embassy in Cairo. Photographs captured the moment. Two monsters, one smile. By 1943, the United States stood alone. All of Europe, all of Asia, most of Africa. The Allies had been reduced to islands, colonies, and stubborn outposts. The Axis now controlled over 70% of the world's population. Global radio stations were jammed with propaganda in dozens of languages. Nazi children learned Russian. Soviet children learned German. A new language, Newsbreak, was being tested as a future global tongue. But empires built on terror rot from within. Cracks formed quickly. The ideological differences that had been painted over in the name of conquest began to reopen. In occupied Warsaw, Gestapo officers clashed with NKVD agents over prisoner interrogations. In Tehran, Soviet commissars criticized the brutality of SS field units. And in Berlin, whispers began, "The Slavs multiply faster than we do." Stalin had no illusions about Hitler's ambitions. He had already begun preparing secret fortifications in the Urals. Hitler, paranoid as ever, ordered that every Soviet scientist working on the nuclear project be shadowed by the SS. Trust dissolved. In 1944, the facade broke. Hitler, believing Stalin planned a surprise betrayal, struck first. Operation Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods, was launched without warning. German divisions stormed into Western Soviet territories. Blitzkrieg tanks rolled into Minsk, then Kiev, then Smolensk. The Eastern Front had opened after all, but it was too late. Because Stalin had also been preparing. The Soviet response was immediate. A secret army, 4 million strong, drawn from Siberia, Mongolia, and Chinese defectors, poured westward like a human tsunami. The war between the Axis partners was now the largest conflict in human history. And the rest of the world watched, waited, bled. The U.S., now fully committed, opened fronts wherever the Axis was weakest: Venezuela, Morocco, New Guinea. But it wasn't enough to retake continents. Not yet. Instead, Roosevelt bet on survival. He funded resistance cells across Europe and Asia, dropped supplies behind enemy lines, and poured everything into one final gamble: the Manhattan Project. In this timeline, the bomb came late. But it came furious. On August 2, 1946, the first atomic weapon detonated, not over Japan, but over the city of Krakow, where joint Nazi-Soviet command had relocated after Berlin descended into civil war. The fireball rose into the sky like a new sun, and with it came a message: the world would no longer be theirs. Hitler, hiding in the Bavarian Alps, died 2 weeks later. Whether by suicide or Soviet assassin, no one knows. Stalin, wounded in an airstrike in Lviv, vanished. Moscow claimed he lived. Others claimed a body double ruled in his place. By 1947, the Axis was gone, but so was the world that had been. Europe lay in ruins. Asia was fractured. Africa, carved up by puppet regimes, teetered between starvation and revolution. The United States emerged as the sole surviving superpower, but it was changed, scarred, authoritarian, and ever vigilant. New York, Chicago, and Houston were ringed with nuclear bunkers. The UN was born in a submarine fortress off the coast of Iceland. The new world capital became Reykjavik, a symbol of isolation, neutrality, and survival. The Red Kaiser, as history came to call Stalin, had gambled on partnership with a madman. Together, they nearly conquered the earth. And in the end, they destroyed each other. The world never forgot. Statues of Hitler and Stalin were melted into bullets. Every schoolchild learned the warning, no tyrant reigns forever. But when two hold hands, the world burns faster. As the shadows of history deepen, remember, some secrets were buried for a reason. What you've seen tonight scratches the surface of a darkness that still whispers beneath the ruins, hidden files, erased memories, and forbidden truths that could change everything we thought we knew. Beware the cost of uncovering what was meant to stay forgotten. The past isn't done with us yet. Are you ready to face what lurks beyond the silence?